Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. At one time, promoting the notion of the UK actually leaving the EU was regarded as a sign of insanity. One tinged perhaps with suspicious anti-foreigner motivation or even nostalgic Little Englander traits. As half Scottish, with a bit of Welsh and Irish thrown in, I'm rather amused to be thought of as a Little Englander, but actually I believe I'm more of a global Britisher. I dread too what our Swiss and Norwegian colleagues think of being called anti-European because they're not in the EU. In reality, we all love Europe, but we just want a different relationship with the EU. But what was once unthinkable has now become thinkable. Whilst outside of this room, the Eurozone is again in crisis over Grexit. We have 10 days to go, apparently. We can here, I hope, consider seriously, rationally, and logically the pluses and minuses of ending the EU's membership of the EU, UK's membership of the EU, and establishing a new, friendly, trade-based relationship in its place. I initiated this conference because I felt that if we Conservatives were offering an in-out referendum over the European Union, which I personally welcome, then we should be looking not just at the favoured renegotiated in option, but at the negotiated out option as well, particularly if in the event the British people decide to leave. And I hope today will add to the debate and inform people of the facts behind the alternatives to this membership, and see through all the scaremongering, the drama, the threats of pestilence, plague, doom and disaster should we leave. Now, we've heard from excellent speakers, Norway and Switzerland, their models, and I'm proposing another option, a British option, which sits somewhere between these two. It's explained in my book, Time to Jump. By the way, this is a British lobster being slowly boiled alive by Brussels, hence the title, Time to Jump. But the option is a form of the EEA agreement of Norway, but has more flexibility and democracy of the Swiss bilateral approach. But it is a unique option. I call it EEA Lite in the same way you have diet or light versions of regular beverages, less concentrated. But I can't guarantee it will make you lose weight. So let's set this in context. If the British people do vote out in an in-out referendum, what happens next? Understanding this process helps condition the choices we have. So with an out vote, the UK government would inform the EU Council under Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, as Martin Howe said, that we wish to end our EU membership. Now, Article 50 states that an EU member state may withdraw from the EU, quote, in accordance with its own constitutional requirements, and goes on to quote that the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that departing state, setting out arrangements for its withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. Now, lawyers tell me that the word shall is a powerful one. The EU shall negotiate. And Lisbon is the EU's constitution after all. Now, a withdrawal agreement suggests a deep and comprehensive trade, economic and political agreement. Of course, in the event that such an agreement is not available, we will revert automatically to the default position that Ruth Lee touched on, that of the WTO model. And by the way, you know, we already have that with India, the US, China, Japan and Australia as we speak. And we wouldn't therefore be in such bad company if that happened. But frankly, given the fact that at least 4.5 million EU jobs, new studies, Global Britain and the Democracy Movement have said 6.5 million, depend on exports to the UK from the rest of the EU, the EU 27, the other EU 27, it is pretty certain that we will get a great deal far better than the WTO. The UK, after all, is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's got the largest financial centre in the world and has the highest G8 growth at present as well. And we like to buy German cars. Nearly 3/4 of UK registered cars are built in the rest of the EU every year, 3/4. And we like Italian shoes and French wine and Portuguese port. Indeed, British consumers employ 1 million Germans, 500,000 French, 400,000 Spanish, and 300,000 Italians through our trade. And we bought 280 billion euros of EU goods in 2013. That's more than some economies. And our goods deficit is an enormous £56 billion, and will only rise with the euro going down and the stagnant eurozone. So I think, in short, the world has changed, and the UK needs to be more global and less regional. Jaguar Land Rover, fantastic Indian-owned British company, now has its largest market, not in the UK or the EU, but in China. And only 20% of its product goes to the EU. And 90% of the world's growth is going to come from outside the European Union, and mainly in services. So trade deals, I believe, come down to trade and the benefits of trade, not politics, which is rather the point of this conference. Now, under Article 50, we'll have 2 years to negotiate this withdrawal agreement, though that could be extended if we agree to it. But what alternate trade model suits us best? This is what we've been touching on today. In that scenario, I believe a deal should be quick, familiar, addresses key concerns, key UK concerns such as immigration and self-government, is based on existing and proven EU arrangements, and reduces uncertainty to a minimum. That's why I propose what I call EEA Lite. It's a British model based on a proven EU format. The full EEA agreement, the regular one between the EU and Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, is regarded internationally as being a great success and is over 21 years old now. It has hardly needed any change in that time. And as with the regular EEA agreement, EEA Lite would return to the UK powers over farming, fishing, trade and our own customs union, foreign affairs and defence, justice and home affairs, the economy. It would restore financial services to control of the UK city and return employment, social policy and health and safety, or health and safety too. Not a bad start, surely. And it doesn't mean, by the way, the loss of key worker benefits, such as 4-week holidays or cutting the minimum wage. But there are two major problems with existing regular EEA, as Hemming has touched on. They are immigration and influence, in my view. Many claim that Norway lacks influence because the EU retains control over the EU single market. It is a facts democracy, they say. But this is only true in small part, because as the EU accounts for just 9% of Norway's laws, the other 91% Norway controls to some extent itself. Now, this is compared to the UK, where 50% or 70% of our laws are made in Brussels. So Norway doesn't have a bad deal in that sense. And also it feeds into these rather secretive comitology committees in the Commission. And EFTA, in fact, sits on 500 of these expert committees and influence proposals before I get to see them as an MEP, or even it gets the British ministers in the Council of the EU Council. However, to ensure Britain does not succumb to even 9% of control from the EU, such as the Postal Directive problem that Hemming mentioned, I propose that under EEA Lite, the UK actually leaves the EU single market and recreates our own UK single market. Sounds dramatic? Not really, because over half of UK businesses now think the EU single market is more of a cost than a benefit. And even the EU puts the cost at 2.5 times the benefits, the single market. Business for Britain has found over 2/3 of US and Asian investors in the UK. They want a looser relationship with the EU. And so I don't think this will actually affect foreign direct investment, because critically, only 8% of the UK economy trades with the EU. That's 40% of our exports, but it's only 20% of our economy that's actually exports at all. And only 5% of businesses, UK businesses, actually trade with the EU. So it's 8% of our economy, 5% of businesses. And that's far, far less than many other EU states. And even non-EU Norway exports 5 times per head more than we do, and we're in the EU, and the Swiss is 3 times as much. Now, this is the nub. Leaving the EU single market would mean the UK would, by definition, take back control of the 92% of the UK economy and 95% of businesses that are not trading with the EU. And we can cut out the masses of EU red tape laid on them. The Working Time Directive is playing havoc with the NHS. Large Combustion Plant Directive, REACH Chemicals Directive, for example. We face 150,000 pages and 35 chapters of acquis laws, which make the EU so uncompetitive globally. Even the French Prime Minister's economic advisors have stated that EU overregulation is a big factor in the EU's relative economic decline. And do bear in mind, the EU's share of world wealth, or world GDP, has slid from 36% in 1980 to 15% recently. It's a huge slide. But while slashing red tape, we can still maintain full access to EU single market for our exporters and full access to our market for EU producers. It works both ways. And we can do this while saving £60 million a day in membership fees. That's 81 new hospitals every year, or 480 new schools every year we're giving away in EU membership. And based on what Switzerland and Norway actually pay, and by the way, they don't pay directly for market access, that's a myth, simply untrue. They pay separate voluntary social contributions. And we would be paying, on that basis, £1.5 billion a year, not £20 billion a year we pay now. Huge difference. And we will be not paying Brussels, we'll not be routing it through Brussels, but I believe we should route it through a new body called the UK Grants Body, which is very like Norway grants. They do their own grants now directly. So the UK will get the credit for UK taxpayers' money going abroad, not the Eurocrats. And nor will a fifth of our development aid have to go through Brussels and suffer huge waste. I propose a powerful EU-UK joint committee, a bit like the EU-Swiss joint committee you have, which would take the form of a regular mini-summit. And as the EU's largest trading partner, we could use this committee to bring pressure over EU legislation affecting our exporters and businesses, and we can discuss their foreign affairs and global issues. Now compare this influence to the influence today when we only have 8.2% voting power in the EU's Council of Ministers, and we've been left isolated on votes 15 times in 2.5 years. Like the EEA Joint Parliamentary Committee, which I personally served on, we'd have an EU-UK Joint Parliamentary Committee between British MPs and EU MEPs. So we will keep the influence, and I think we'll have far more of it and far less. Second, on immigration, the regular EEA agreement also has a problem because freedom of peoples goes unchecked. We cannot go on with net immigration running at the size of 2 cities the size of Cambridge. We have to have quotas, and Switzerland is now it has safeguards on immigration, and that Swiss referendum will bring an end to mass immigration, and we'll have to have a similar deal. Now, these quotas would prioritise UK skill needs and would treat all international applicants fairly and equally, whether they're from Canada, Australia or India, or from Romania, Bulgaria or Poland. And under EEA Lite, we'd regain our seat at the World Trade Organization, where we just have an empty chair now, because we handed it over to the EU, and we'll do our own bilateral trade agreements. I serve on the International Trade Committee, and these EU FTAs are taking up to 10 years to negotiate. India is 7 years so far and has gone nowhere. And the EU is getting diverted by human rights clauses and emissions clauses, and it's trying to tell Canada and Australia how to conduct their human rights, while at the same time trying to do deals with China and Burma. This nearly caused the collapse of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, CETA, which is an excellent deal. And TTIP is now in trouble, as Ruth mentioned, through its audio-visual chapters being dropped, and this Investor States Dispute Settlement, ISDS, is causing huge controversy. Now, on withdrawal, as Martin said, we have the choice of retaining existing EU FTAs if we can get mutual consent to that, or embrace EFTA deals. We can take back our seats on UN bodies such as the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, and the UN Department of Political Affairs. We've given all of those roles over to the EU. And as well as rejoining EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, we would not necessarily have to leave all parts of the EU. We could stay in EU programmes or agencies just as EFTA members do, such as the EU's Horizon 2020 research programme, which is one area where we really do benefit and get a surplus back. And we're paying for it anyway. And in fact, Switzerland, Canada and Israel are all members of that Horizon 2020, though President Juncker, just finishing up, President Juncker is being attacked today by Nobel Prize winners for actually taking money out of that research programme for infrastructure. We could stay in EU programmes like the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, or EU agencies such as European Maritime Safety Agency or Medicines Agency, if we wish to. But please not the Galileo programme, which is a huge waste of money in my view, and no Jean Monnet scholarships either. So finally, without going into much detail, all of these things are terribly detailed, so thank you for your patience today. But we would replace the problem that Norway has, the EU Commission and the dreadful European Court of Justice overseeing trade and state aid rules in this country. I believe we should have a UK Trade Court, a UK Surveillance Authority, and the UK Supreme Court should decide. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I believe Britain faces a far better, freer, and more prosperous future outside of the EU based on this EEA Lite model. It's a model that Professor Damon Chalmers, a professor of LSE, EU law at LSE, concludes is, quote, legally feasible. And former Chancellor Lord Lamont says that it is one of many options, it raises many options that ought to be part of the debate leading up to the referendum. I'm most grateful for their support and comments, and I'm most grateful for you for hearing me out. Thank you very much.